into another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by thehoosier.com of the On3 Sports Network. Happy August 11th, a.k.a. the final dog day of summer. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, I went on and on about how this is the time of year. And again, it is an official time of year. I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but I looked up earlier. August 11th is the final day of what is considered the time period of the dog days of summer. And you know what that means? It means we're finally moving downhill a little bit away from all of this ridiculous heat. And I am absolutely sick of it. You're probably sick of hearing me talk about it. But here we are once again. We're about midway through August. We're barreling towards, I should say, the beginning of college football season. We're just a couple of weeks away from week 0, which means next week I'm ready to start giving my picks again. I'm excited to get back into that world of the sports betting and just having fun picking games and picking spreads and that sort of thing. Had a really good year last year, at least by my standards. I don't bet a ton of money, but I bet enough to have fun with it. And when you come out on top, that's always a good thing. So I'm looking forward to getting that underway again here in a few weeks. And after week 0, of course, week 1, a big week 1 for Indiana. And not that it's big when it comes to the opponent, but of course it's a new season, Old Dominion. And then you got a couple of other non-con games with Kennesaw State and Indiana State before things get really real with Illinois in week 4. And that will, of course, be an exciting portion of the season. So looking forward to getting all that ready and rolling here over the next few weeks. But right now, we've had an odd little entrance of the season, or into this time of year, if that makes any sense. We've had an odd little thing thrown in here. It's the Puerto Rican games that Indiana basketball has been taking part in. Their off-season exhibitions against the Puerto Rican university or national team. I don't know exactly which one it is. Either way, it's not that big of a deal. And then you also had 2 games, one of them which will be played today against a Serbian national team, which is called Serbia or Mega Superbet. Always love these weird team names that come from overseas. I'm sure they're not weird to those people over there, but I remember 4 years ago when Mike Woodson's team went down and faced BC Mega. I don't remember which country they were from, but I remember that also being another odd name for a team that Indiana was playing against. So you had BC Mega 4 years ago. You've got Mega Superbet this year. And we're going to talk more about kind of how things went down with our guy Kyler Staley here in just a few minutes. But one thing I just want to point out real quick. We all know that these games aren't broadcasted, and so there was no way for me to watch what happened. But I did see that Indiana went on a massive run after being down big in their second game, which was their first game against the Serbian national team. They ended up outscoring them by like I think it was a 50-point differential by the time Indiana began going on their run and really taking momentum away from the Serbian national team. So, and maybe I shouldn't be referring to them as the Serbian national team. That's 2 totally different things. When I'm saying a national team, I'm assuming it is the best players, or one would assume that it's their best players playing like if it was an Olympic team. That's not at all what this is, I don't think. So should probably quit referring to the teams that Indiana is playing against as the national team. It's just a team from a different country, of course. But a lot of mystery, a lot of intrigue with that. So in just a couple of minutes, we'll bring in Kyler Staley to kind of break down all of that and then go into a couple of other Indiana basketball related topics as well. And then we'll get into a number of other things on the other side. Not going to be a massive show today, but I do want to get into a few things. We're going to talk a little bit about the coaches poll that was released earlier last week. Of course, Indiana being a part of that. And I've got some reactions and thoughts on some of the other teams that were included and where they were included. So, and also I'll share my thoughts just in general about preseason polls. I did that last year and I'll do it again this year because there's good and bad, of course, ways to look at it. And I'll get into more of that when we get to it on the other side of our guest segment. And then we'll also get into a few other small matters, and then we'll wrap up today's show and call it a Monday. Really looking forward to getting into the meat and potatoes of football season here. Again, like I said, next week it's kind of the first real appetizer. With week 0, we'll have 4 games. And not that I'm going to break down every single game, but I'm going to kind of share what I like about each game and what I'm looking forward to watching when it comes to those. Of course, you have one of them played in Ireland like you have each and every year now. So I always look forward to that. This year you got Kansas State and Iowa State. Farmageddon, as that game is called. Love the nickname of that game. So that'll be interesting to see. And then, of course, I'll share my picks. Last year, I've infamously mentioned this already, or mentioned what I infamously did last year, which was I didn't bet, but I picked 4 games or picked 4. I picked a 4-leg parlay. That's what it was. And the parlay would have hit, but of course I didn't lay the bet down. I called it a practice bet, and it was embarrassing nonetheless. So we're not going to do that this year. So looking forward to doing that next week, but we'll go and get into this week's content here in just a second. So before we bring on Kyler Staley real quick, I've got something set up here for you, just to make it a little more appealing to look at this time. But I want to tell you about our friends with Rhoback. There is only one way to describe Rhoback. That is best fit and best feel. For those who aren't familiar with Rhoback, they are completely changing the game with their incredibly comfortable activewear. Rhoback has released so many items within their new licensed game day collection, and it's our favorite as well, with novel polo designs and clean hoodie and quarter zip designs for some of your favorite schools. Of course, ours being the Indiana Hoosiers. It's definitely worth checking out. Nobody else on the market is pairing these level of custom designs with this quality of activewear. Rhoback's everyday shorts or their Delta performance pants are the perfect pairing as well. They are both super comfortable, have an elastic waistband, and great fabric that is made to have the appearance of a nice short look, but the comfort for a day on the move. Rhoback has also been proudly leading the NIL charge, having signed partnerships with multiple college football stars, past and present, and are becoming the go-to brand for college athletes across the country. And you can use the code IND20 on Rhoback.com for a generous 20% off for all new customers. That's spelled RHOBACK.com for 20% off all performance polos, shorts, and more with the code IND20. And this is the first time I pulled these up. For those of you who have not seen what these look like, this is the Indiana collection. So if this is something, if you're somebody's looking for something a little nicer for your game day outfit, whatever you want to call it, this is the stuff to be checking out. I always loved the quarter zips. Back whenever I was in high school, I loved wearing my Indiana quarter zip, and I probably got made fun of it being in Kentucky, but that's just me, right? If you're living in Indiana, you're not going to get made fun of for that sort of thing like I was. But nonetheless, if you're interested in this, of course, use our code IND20. You'll get yourself a discount, and of course, it makes us look good. So there you go. There's your ad read for the day. It is basketball recruiting analyst Kyler Staley. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think the last time I was on here, I was driving to Charleston, and we were having connection issues. But I'm back in my home, so hopefully the connection's all good and everything. But yeah, we got some Indiana basketball going on in August, so that's been kind of weird to get used to and stuff. But it's also been fun to kind of see them on the floor for a little bit as well.
It's very strange, and of course, a lot of people initially upset with the lack of broadcasting of these exhibition games down in Puerto Rico. The same thing happened back when Mike Woodson took his team to the Bahamas 4 years ago, whenever it was. So not all that surprising, but I frequently mention when Louisville did their off-season trip last year, they were able to have some sort of offshoot brand of people put together a broadcast on YouTube. And I know Indiana is usually really strict about their stuff. So I'm not surprised, like I said, but it is disappointing for those who want to be able to get that early glimpse of what this team could look like.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's 2025, live streaming is, the number one thing in entertainment, right? There's live streams for anything that you can find and stuff, but there's zero other than, the clips of the other media outlets and things. And, IU's done a pretty good job of putting together like 3-4 minute, highlight clips of each game and stuff. But as long as you're on social media and you see the clips and everything like that, I know it's frustrating. You can't watch a full game and stuff, but if you're on social media, YouTube, all that stuff, you can see some good highlights, clips, and everything like that. And just obviously trusting the guys that are obviously covering it, and those guys obviously getting eyes on Indiana firsthand down there. But yeah, frustrating. But at the same time, it's like, what are you going to do at this point?
So 2 of the 3 games are in the books as of the time of this recording. And of course, this show will release Monday morning. Their final game will take place at 11 o'clock. We don't have any, thing to talk about that game, of course. But through the first 2 games, and again, this is basically just from your perspective of what's been reported. What do you kind of like from what's been said of this team with their performance down in Puerto Rico?
I think for overall, I think it's, going about as expected as what I thought it would. There's been some hiccups, here and there and stuff. There's been some things that they've had to work on, or they're going to need to work on, as they get prepared for the actual season and stuff. But, I think overall, the one thing that I really, really like about them, and this was showed in Saturday night's game, is just how hard those guys play. And, those guys are really, really competitive on their on both sides of the ball. Yes, maybe the defense, as far as the skill level concerned, is a little bit suspect right now. But, I think DeVries will get those guys, really cooking and really clicking on the defensive end as well. But they play really, really fast too. And everything pretty much DeVries has said, I think is true. He said, I want to play a certain way and stuff. You're seeing that on the floor versus, with Mike Woodson, not necessarily calling him a liar or anything like that. Mike Woodson talked about, he wanted to play fast and things like that. But then you would see on the floor, it's like, well, you're not doing that. So DeVries is really backed up, I think, of what he said. We've got 2, practice games essentially that we've seen. But, Indiana, for them to be down, I think, as much as 24 points the other night or on Saturday night, and then go on an insane 70-19 run. That just shows that this team really competes and that they're kind of bought into what they want to do. Seeing some really good things for freshman Trent Sisley. I think that's really, really probably the surprising part on it. Not necessarily surprising that he was going to produce, but just, what he's doing on the floor and how he's playing. I will say from a 3-point shooting perspective, it hasn't been the greatest for Indiana, but I do like the amount of attempts that they're taking. I think it was 33 the first game and then 29 Saturday night's game. But there's a lot of good things. I think, it's going to take some time. Even when they get into the season, it's going to take them a little bit of time to click, as a team on the floor or whatnot. But this trip's been great for them. I think from a team chemistry building standpoint, you've seen clips of these guys going for snorkeling or kayak rides and things like that, going to the beach. I think that's the most important part, right? Is getting these guys together, connecting, off the floor, just building team chemistry. And then hopefully when you get into the season, a few more games, the non-conference slate or whatever, that's when you want to see it really start clicking on the floor, ahead of the Big Ten play.
You'd mentioned Trent Sisley and his ability to make an impact in these games. And of course, the competition level is hard to gauge where all these teams they're playing are at, because it's teams from overseas in Europe and that sort of thing. You're playing the Puerto Rican national team, all that type of good stuff. But for Trent Sisley as a freshman, in a day and age where freshmen, they do make an impact, but Trent Sisley wasn't necessarily somebody who, when you look at just the overall freshman class, he wasn't the end-all be-all freshman who's expected to come in and easily make his name known. Do you think this is a sign of things to come, that maybe from the get-go he's somebody who's going to be an impact player for this Indiana team, or is this more of just because of the lack of competition potentially in these games?
And I'll say this, if Trent Sisley were to have stayed with, and this is no knock on Heritage Hills, the high school that he played for before he transferred to Montverde, if he would have stayed at Heritage Hills, I don't think he'd be as ready as what he is come in. But that one year when he was down at Montverde, his game went to a whole new level. I think, he's expanded his game, where in the high school level, they wanted him to play more posts and stuff like that. Like he's shown his ability to stretch the floor. He's done really well so far. I'm looking at the box score from last night, went 2 of 3 from behind the arc, and then 3 of 3 the first game. So he's only missed 1 3-point shot. He's not a guy that's going to, chuck up a lot of shots like a Lamar Wilkerson's going to do, right? But showing that he's consistent from behind the arc is awesome. And then obviously you look at his athleticism and what he does. I wrote a few good stories at thehoosier.com of Trent Sisley, and really it's just, he came in this summer not really looking like a freshman. And that's a lot of he was down at Montverde, working on his body, working on his game. If you were just to go in there blindly and watch a practice and you didn't know who's a freshman, who's a senior, you wouldn't think that Trent Sisley's a freshman just by the way he plays and his size. But DeVries has talked really highly of him. The teammates have talked really highly of him. So he's going to come in this year. He's going to definitely have a role on this team. He's going to get some good minutes off the bench. But, long-term potential, I think Indiana fans should be ecstatic because he's a guy that loves playing for Indiana. I don't think you have to really necessarily worry about any transferring or anything like that. He always wanted to go to Indiana. His family's an Indiana family. So I think long-term, he has potential to be a really, really good, dare I even say an all-time great Hoosier just from the way that he's projecting and what he's showing on the floor.
Another player, this is somebody who did not participate. I don't even know if they made the trip, but Jason Drake, of course, I was going to say a new addition, but literally everybody on this team is a new addition. What was the reason that he was unable to make the trip down to Puerto Rico?
It looks like it's a lower body injury. So I do know when they had the open practice a few weeks ago where the media members were allowed to go watch, he was a non-participant and stuff. But as far as what that lower body injury is, I don't know off the top of my head. They've done a pretty good job of keeping that kind of secretive. But
as Indiana usually does.
As Indiana usually does, right? But, it is a little bit, and this is just my thought and everything, I do think it's a little bit concerning. Maybe it's nothing to really really focus in on. Maybe it's not as bad as what people think. But for him to not at least make the trip, Nick Dorn's a guy that's he's battling an injury as well. He's a guy that made the trip. He's there. He's not playing, but he made the trip. So it is a little concerning, that Jason Drake is not at the trip at least being there, but it could all just be fine. It could just be precautionary, but he's the one guy other than the other international guy that they got coming in, Andre. He's the only two guys that did not make this trip. So, okay. Which is a pretty good sign overall, I guess.
Between, I guess, really the veterans of this team, and I guess, like we said, all these guys are new, so none of them are veterans when it comes to from an Indiana perspective. But those who have played the longest, there's several guys who kind of impresses you and can maybe step out and maybe be a potential leader for this team come this fall.
Man, I think it's between three guys right now, and it's probably the three-headed monster that this team's kind of built around with Tatum Connerway, Lamar Wilkerson, and Tucker DeVries. Necessarily hasn't been the greatest shooting greatest shooting, showing from those guys. But as far as what they're doing on the floor, they're exactly why, DeVries kind of recruited these guys. And obviously Tucker DeVries is his son, but Tucker DeVries is just overall, I mean, he's a game changer. He does so much on the floor, makes guys better around him. And he's showed a lot of his versatility, playing on the wing, playing in the post, and just showing why he is arguably a top 20 college basketball player in the country. So getting him is just, and seeing what he's going to provide for Indiana has been huge. And Lamar Wilkerson, he's showing off his trigger from behind the arc. He went 4 of 7 from the last game. So, and hit a really deep three from the clips that I've seen from him. But the Breeze is always going to give him the green light when it comes to shooting. That's why Indiana, paid him a lot of NIL money to come here and be that shooter, right? And then Tatum Connerway, he's just, an overall threat in the backcourt, is, especially from the defensive end, kind of the head of the snake of this team. His playmaking ability has been phenomenal to watch, and just his size, on the ball and what he can do. He is a pretty capable three-point shooter, but he's more of a guy that's going to make plays in the lane, and especially defend the hardest that he can. But, looking at those guys, and I'll even throw in Reed Bailey as well, the other starter. He showed some really, really good things as well. Sam Alexis off the bench. So it's a lot of, older guys on this team and stuff like that. They've showed some really good promise. And it's probably going to take a little bit, like I mentioned earlier, for those guys to fully click. But for what they're showing, they're showing exactly why Indiana went out and recruited these guys, why some of these guys were some of the top transfer portal guys this past offseason and everything. But the older group, I think Indiana's pretty well set when it comes to the older guys on this team.
I want to look ahead now at the non-con schedule for Indiana men's basketball. I kind of went through this on my own a couple of months ago whenever it was officially announced. I think this is one of the more balanced non-conference schedules when it comes to, tough competition versus the cupcakes, and I like the way that it kind of lays out. You start off with Alabama A&M to tip off the season on November 5th. You immediately get a test right after that in Chicago in a neutral site game with Marquette. So we'll start there. Do you like this matchup against Shaka Smart's Marquette team for this brand new Indiana basketball team with Darren DeVries?
I do like that because I think Marquette's going to be a really, really good team. This was a game that was already put in place, before Mike Woodson departed from Indiana. So we always knew that this was going to be the game going into this season that's going to kind of start things off, other than that Alabama A&M game, this is going to be the game that, you're really going to see it's going to test Indiana right off the bat, right? So Marquette's going to be a really good team. They bring back a lot of good guys. Shaka Smart's got those guys rolling down. With Marquette. So it's going to be a challenge, neutral site game. It's in Chicago. I totally expect Indiana fans to really travel there for that game, So it's a good matchup. It really is a good matchup. I do expect a lot of high scoring there and everything. So, but I think it's a really, really good matchup to kind of start off that non-conference slate.
And then after that, you got 3 more games that will likely be considered bye games. Milwaukee, Incarnate Word, Lindenwood. I do believe both Milwaukee and Lindenwood have been in the NCAA tournament recently in their respective conferences. But either way, shouldn't matter. Indiana's Indiana. They should take care of business if they are up to their level that they're expected to be. After that, you have Kansas State in Bloomington. Kind of an interesting team to come into Assembly Hall, considering usually you think Indiana facing Kansas, and I know they did that the last couple of years, but you're going to have, why can't I think of the head coach's name?
Jerome Tang.
Jerome Tang. I'm glad you knew that off the top of your head. Well, I couldn't. It's going to be interesting to see Jerome Tang come into Assembly Hall. He's had some scrappy Kansas State teams over his first few seasons in the Big 12. What do you like about this whenever you think of this matchup?
Yeah, I think it's just, it's a power conference game, right? It's a Power 5 matchup. So it's good that Indiana has these types of games coming into Assembly Hall. Compare it last year to the South Carolina game. Not necessarily going to be a needle mover when it comes to your net or anything like that, but it's obviously a game that you want to win, right? And show that you can take care of business at home against some pretty solid competition. I don't know exactly what Kansas State brings back this year. I know last year there was high expectations for them and they fell pretty short, way short actually. So one of those teams that spent a lot of NIL money that just didn't pan out, but it'll be interesting. I really don't know. Obviously Jerome Tang, I think, is a pretty good coach. So he'll have those teams kind of clicking as well. So, but I do like that matchup. I like the random matchup with it. It's not I don't think it's
very random.
I don't think it's a series. So I don't expect Indiana. Maybe they will next year. But I don't expect Indiana to go to Kansas State after this or not. But
I still want to see them play in the Octagon of Doom. Just because it's, Indiana never, the Big 12 teams that aren't, a Kansas, that sort of thing, you never get to travel to those arenas. So it'd be cool to see Indiana go on the road. But again, I agree with you. I don't think they'll make that return matchup, but it would still be cool to see if it did end up playing out that way.
Yeah, it would be cool. I hope that Indiana has these random, matchups against Big 12 opponents, SEC opponents, sprinkled into their non-conference schedule. But it'll be an interesting one, I would think on paper, it being at home, I think Indiana should win that one.
And then rounding things out, I'll just list all of them, and then I'll get into the 2 that really matter. You have Bethune-Cookman, then Louisville and Kentucky, Chicago State and Siena. And, of course, I want to focus in on Louisville and Kentucky. First of all, Indiana should play Louisville and Kentucky every single season. I've said that a lot. I would love if there was a way that you face one at home, one on the road each and every year. I know the Louisville game is in Indianapolis, so it's a bit of a different scenario. But Indiana will face them on December 6th in Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Pat Kelsey, of course, really good first season. Did the exact same thing that Indiana's doing right now. Rebuilt the entire roster from scratch. Ended up having a pretty good year in a fairly weak ACC, but they had a pretty good regular season. Should be, and of course, we all know that Louisville team last year destroyed Indiana down in the Bahamas. So an opportunity for revenge with a whole new cast of characters. What do you like about, again, playing against Louisville again with a whole new look roster for the Hoosiers?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's Louisville and Kentucky. The Indiana should be playing those guys every year. They've got the Kentucky series scheduled for the next 4 years, so we already know what to expect with that. But hopefully after this season, a Louisville series, a home and home at least, gets put together and stuff. But when you look at both, and I'm going to kind of put Kentucky and Louisville together, when you look at both Mark Pope and Pat Kelsey, that's who a lot of people are comparing DeVries to, right? And it's, those guys, both those guys last year had 2 phenomenal seasons and 2 really, really good teams. Both made the NCAA tournament with completely new rosters. And for them to go in there, I think that's what, media, national media, fans, that's what they're expecting Darren DeVries to do. He's an up-and-coming coach. He's got a lot of upside as being one of the top coaches in the country. And then seeing what Pat Kelsey and Mark Pope did, there's kind of your blueprint of how, Indiana fans want DeVries to kind of lay the foundation, as you could say, with Indiana. But it should be a really good matchup. It's neutral site, so I totally expect Louisville and Indiana fans to be a 50-50 split there. But December is going to be a tough one. It is, because you got the Louisville game, and then the next following weekend you get a full week off, and then you're right at Rupp Arena. So
it's great though. I love the spacing of it, and I love the back-to-backness of it. I mean, it's honestly, that's a stretch right there in the non-conference schedule where if things go your way, you're feeling really good about where you stand. But if you drop both of those, of course, you're kind of scratching your head a little bit if you're Indiana.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Marquette and Kansas State, I can't think of who they played, but Marquette and Kansas State games, I wouldn't call those must wins. I would call the Kansas State one a must win.
Yeah.
Marquette's going to be a little bit different because that's going to be your first real test with this team. So they could get beat by 5 points. They could get beat by 20 points. They could win a game. It's just, you just don't know until you know, right? And then you go into the Louisville, Kentucky game. You would hope that Indiana can maybe beat Louisville. It's going to be really tough to go to Rupp Arena and beat Kentucky. And I think everybody kind of knows that. Year two of Mark Pope, there's high expectations there. Kentucky fans are going to be very eager to see Indiana there. They've obviously got the Lamar Wilkerson thing. They were pretty heated with Indiana taking Lamar Wilkerson, so that's going to be it's going to be a pretty hostile environment. But if you can somehow go 2-2 when you look at those top non-conference games, I think you feel pretty good if you're Indiana, and then you have some momentum. You can rest, a little bit, because you've got, I think, some easier games before conference play kind of starts after the Kentucky game. Take care of business there. Go into the Big Ten season with your health, hopefully, and be ready to compete, and hopefully get some big time wins and continue to build your NCAA tournament resume that way.
Last thing before we wrap up, do you have any names that Indiana fans should be keeping an eye on when it comes to the recruiting trail? I know this type of year, it feels like there's a lot going on with basketball as opposed to what we're used to. And on top of that, we're also getting geared up for football season. So there's a lot going on right now with kind of the new academic/athletic calendar in collegiate sports. But who are some of the names when it comes to the recruiting trail that the Hoosier fans should keep an eye on?
Yeah, and obviously it's a lot more going on recruiting wise than what it kind of has been the last few years. Obviously with Mike Woodson, you had, they had an offer, and then it'd be a few years where you get familiar with these guys that Indiana's recruiting. But, with DeVries, it being a brand new staff, there's tons of offers being thrown out left and right from this Indiana team in a good way. But I think the most important part is that they're getting these visits from these high profile recruits. Darren Rippey Jr., just talking about the 2026 class. You got Darren Rippey Jr., who's got a visit set for October. Ethan Taylor, who's one of the best big men in the country. He just set up a visit at the Hoosier.com. Throwback, right? The Hoosier.com, where it was able to confirm. So we've got Ethan Taylor coming in, who's probably their number one target when it comes to big men in the 2026 class. Latrell Aldman, a guy that visited Indiana earlier this summer, kind of probably the top target for Indiana right now in the 2026 class. And then you throw in Jordan Smith Jr., he was teammates with Prince Alexander Moody for Team Takeover. So those guys are really familiar and everything. Indiana's going to go after him. So trying to think of a few names. Junior County is another guy. So he's got a visit set for September. I have noticed that there's quite a bit of, I would say they'll probably end up having 3 visitors homecoming weekend for football, and that will obviously be Hoosier Hysteria weekend as well. So the main thing is just kind of keeping up with all these visits, right? And I think the important thing is, and the positive thing is that Indiana is getting these guys on campus, and these guys are seeing, even with the new coaching staff and DeVries kind of in a new environment, it's showing that they're interested in seeing, they like what the play style that DeVries has. So, and then all the guys, the last thing I'll say, all the guys that they're recruiting just makes sense. DeVries is not offering a guy just because he's got a 5-star label or he's going to be McDonald's All-American. He's offering high-profile guys, but they're guys that make sense and that would fit into his system. Whereas, in the previous years, you felt like, these guys, Mike Woodson, his staff offering guys, just because they got that 5-star label and they don't necessarily fit into the system or what Indiana needed. DeVries really honing in on, okay, this guy, he's a top player in the country, but if we get him, he's going to fit really well into our style and kind of what we're trying to build here at Indiana.
Kyler Staley from the Hoosier.com. As always, I appreciate your insight and knowledge of the game. And of course, got a lot to be excited about, a lot of things to question. There's always a lot of mystery with the brand new tenure when it comes not only Indiana basketball, but anytime a new team gets a new head coach and new players. And this is just a different level of intrigue that Indiana basketball has not really ever seen when you're flipping a roster completely. So there's going to be a lot of things that fans are anxious and excited about as you go through these next few months and get the season started in November. So I appreciate your time, and we'll definitely check in as we get closer to the season and talk more basketball.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, John.
A big thanks, as always, to Kyler Staley for his time, and always enjoy the conversation with him. And I'm sure he's excited for a brand new Indiana basketball era with Darren DeVries and an entirely flipped roster. I was always intrigued with what happened with Louisville, Kentucky last season, and if Indiana was ever going to have to go down that path. And, of course, we all knew that if things didn't work out with Mike Woodson, which they did not, they've now been put into that position. So going to be a whole new cast of characters to learn and grow fond of, but it'll be fun to see how things play out when we get to November and get the regular season underway. Hopefully it's a lot more fun this season than it has been the past couple of years. But I do want to transition now into some college football matters. Last week, the coaches poll was released, and we all know that when it comes to rankings, first of all, the coaches poll is probably the least important of the three, and not even probably, it is. Prior to when the college football playoff rankings start getting released, which is not until the latter portion of the season, the poll that most people pay attention to is the AP poll. That'll come out later this week. But the only point of reference we have at this point in time is the coaches poll. And it's your first kind of glimpse at what to expect when it comes to which teams you can, I guess, that are projected to be near the top of the cream of the crop this upcoming season, so to speak. And I mentioned before we got into our basketball stuff with Kyler that there's good and bad when it comes to preseason polls. And the pessimistic side of me wants to say that there's more bad than good with these polls. Because what it does, that it can be good for a particular team, but it may not be good overall for the overall look of the sport. And that is, teams that aren't really good sometimes will be given the benefit of the doubt just because they had a good preseason poll ranking, I should say. Florida State is a really good example of that last year. They were in the top 10, I believe. I don't remember their exact preseason ranking, but I believe they were maybe somewhere between 7, 8, 9, somewhere along those range. But they played in the Ireland game last year against Georgia Tech. Well, we all know that, first of all, not only did they lose that game, they ended up having a horrible season. And the only reason that Florida State had that preseason ranking where they were in the first place was not only was it based on what they were bringing in with the transfer portal, but it was based a lot on what happened last year, what happened last year, yeah, I guess some of that can be taken into consideration, especially if you have a lot of returning players. But if you're retooling your roster, a lot of that is just guessing, right? I mean, they do have a decent amount of returning players, but they also have some new faces like Fernando Mendoza under center, taking over for Curtis Rourke, one of the better quarterbacks, some would say even the best quarterback in the history of Indiana football. Those are some big shoes to fill. And so Indiana coming in at number 19 at this in the coaches poll, I do think that's a fairly honest ranking for them. But it's one of those things when you're expecting what's coming in to replace what was good last year to kind of work out. And I'm not here trying to single out Indiana by any means, but this fits for anybody in the coaches poll. And things usually end up sorting themselves out. But it's interesting seeing teams like Michigan, who had a 7-5 season last year, and they did end things well by, of course, beating Ohio State on the road, who ended up going on to win the national championship, and then also defeating Alabama in a bowl game. And it wasn't, an amazing Alabama team. It's, their first year under Kalen DeBoer, and a lot of people saw that team as underwhelming, at least by Alabama standards. But what we need to know now is Alabama no longer needs to be getting the Nick Saban benefit of the doubt. This is not Nick Saban's Alabama anymore, right? So, yeah, Alabama fans will hold Alabama to that Nick Saban level of standard, but is Kalen DeBoer going to be able to live up to that year in and year out? Like, of course, that remains to be seen. Alabama comes in at number 8, and I'm sure they have the talent to be that good or even better, but Alabama doesn't need to be getting the the Nick Saban boost, if you will. And really last year, if we're being honest, they didn't. A lot of people thought that they could have snuck their way into the college football playoff, but thankfully the committee didn't give into that pressure just because of their brand name being Alabama. They realized they had losses to a team like Oklahoma, who was 6-6. And a lot of people just wanted to ignore that for some reason. They also lost to Vanderbilt. And yes, it was an improved Vanderbilt team, but that Vanderbilt team was still, I believe, out of the top 25 by the end of last year. So, point being with all of this, the good of the college, not the college football playoff rankings, the coaches poll, and any of these preseason polls is just, it's good to just kind of see where things could be or where people expect you to be. But the problem with it is it doesn't always go the way that people project it to end up being like. But Indiana being number 19, I think it's fair. And some of the other opponents on their schedule, I do want to go starting off with the receiving votes. They'll go on the road at Iowa. They received 49 votes, which I believe clocks them in at around 31 or 32, something like that. They've also got Illinois, which comes in number 12 on their schedule. And real quick, before I continue, Illinois has received more hype than I would have ever imagined for a team that they weren't mediocre last year. They were a pretty good, underrated Big Ten team last year. But for a team that I don't even know if they finished the year in the top 25, to receive the amount of love that they have, to be number 12 in the preseason, and all of it is based on the fact that I think Illinois' their big call to, I guess, potential success, if you will, is the fact that they're bringing back everyone that is important to them. Their entire offensive line, their quarterback, a good portion of their defense is coming back. And I guess they're just expecting them to build upon what they started last year, which very well could be the case. But to see all of this expectation being thrown at Illinois when I don't want to say they haven't done anything, but whenever they've yet to really have that proven moment. And I guess they're going to get that this season, but it's interesting to see them ranked so high up. Number 12 just seems like a very high preseason ranking for a team that's based solely on where they could be. You know, maybe they'll be disappointing. But one thing that the good part about this for Indiana is, as long as Illinois doesn't screw up and lose to a team like Duke in the first couple of weeks, then Indiana's going to have a chance for a top 12, maybe even top 10 type of win early on in the season if other teams, of course, lose that are ahead of them, maybe an Arizona State or a Miami, any of those teams that are ranked above Illinois. If they take an early loss, then Illinois could easily find themselves in the top 10 by the time we get to week 4. So it'll be a very good chance for Indiana to get a marquee victory early in the season, which, of course, last year, based on how the schedule ended up panning out, there wasn't a lot of marquee victories on the schedule for them. It's not their fault, it's just the way things played out. Also in the top 25 on Indiana's schedule, you've got number 7, Oregon, who they'll travel to on the road. Of course, Oregon, one of the newbies to the Big Ten. Indiana yet to face them, whether it be at home or on the road. So that'll be a new task and a big challenge for them. Maybe if Indiana finds themselves, I talked about this with Mitchell Page last week. If Indiana finds themselves unbeaten going into that Oregon game, first of all, it would be very impressive. That would mean you beat Illinois and Iowa on the road after that. But that makes the matchup with Oregon your next kind of step forward as a program. If you can find a way to win that game on the road, on the West Coast, that will definitely turn heads if you can do that at that point. That's the game where you probably silence a lot of the critics, especially if all the teams that I'd mentioned, Illinois, Iowa, and of course Oregon, if they're all having good seasons and Indiana defeats all of them up to that point in the season, you've probably silenced everybody. And I'm not predicting any of that to happen by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not saying it can't happen either, but it's one of those things where the scenario, there's definitely a really good golden opportunity for Indiana to have a great year with some really great wins on the resume. So number 7, Oregon, really tough matchup. And then later on, this will be probably the toughest team Indiana will face all year, and maybe one of the toughest teams in college football, maybe the toughest. Penn State currently come in at number 3. Indiana will go on the road. This is likely going to be the best Penn State team that at least I've seen in my time of being someone who follows college football and Indiana football in particular. Penn State's had some good teams. Last year was a really good one. Indiana did not face them, of course. Also, no Tom Allen on this Penn State team. He's moved on to Clemson to be the defensive coordinator. So we won't get to see that Tom Allen Indiana reunion of sorts. But this is going to be James Franklin's prove it season for himself, because Penn State, yeah, they had a good year last year, and they also made a decent run in the college football playoff. But Penn State fans are hungry for something that they haven't had in a long time, which is, of course, a national championship. And they're going to have that expectation to do just that. And, of course, Ohio State will be in the conversation for that as well when it comes to the Big Ten. But it's definitely going to be a very contentious season between both of those two teams. And I fully expect Penn State to be probably the best team in the conference and maybe the best team in college football. So they also, similar to Illinois, they have a lot of almost every important piece is back this year for the Nittany Lions. Of course, off a team that was already in the college football playoffs. So that's what makes them a leg up ahead of Illinois, of course. So lots to be intrigued about when it comes to the upcoming football season. And I guess to kind of bring things full circle, Indiana's kind of going to be able to fly under the radar for a little bit, being number 19. They're not going to get a ton of attention with that ranking. I don't think a lot of people will say they're overrated at 19. Some of the SEC heads, if you will, talking heads, they'll probably think Indiana should be unranked just because that's just the way that they think. They think they're all mighty and their conference is incomparable. But nonetheless, they're number 19, and you're probably not going to hear a whole lot of national complaining from those guys, at least in the early portion of the season. Things will really go one way or the other whenever you get to that Illinois game in week 4. That's really, if you want to circle something big on your calendar early in the season, it's an Indiana-Illinois game in Bloomington. It's already sold out, by the way, so it'll definitely be good atmosphere to take part in, and I'm excited to get to that game. So, all right, couple of other small things that I want to get into before we wrap this up. And again, these don't have a ton to talk about today. I just wanted to get in those kind of, I was going to say quick hitters, but our big things for Indiana basketball and just going over that coaches poll. But here's some other things. One thing that I noticed earlier this week, Oregon becomes the latest, unless I missed another one since then, Oregon became one of the latest power teams to cancel a future non-conference series with another, I guess, P4 opponent, if you will. It's with a Pac-12 opponent. So the Pac-12 isn't, of course, what they used to be. It's now just Oregon State and Washington State. They canceled a future series against them. And I can't remember if they've jumped into the Mountain West or not. I don't think they have. But either way, even though those two brands are no longer really affiliated with the P4, it still is telling that it's going to become more and more common, I think, that you see any program, and especially in the Big Ten and the SEC, canceling series with kind of the lower level teams of the P4, if you even want to include those two that I mentioned in the P4. But you're not going to see many of those anymore unless they're the sponsored games at neutral sites, I would imagine. Or if you get a scheduling agreement series, if you will, between the Big Ten and the SEC, I think I'd be on board for that, like Kurt Signetti had mentioned. But yeah, Oregon, another team. So Indiana got made fun of for it early on because they were one of the first to do it. And of course, Indiana will always get made fun of, especially based off what happened at the end of the year last year. They just were a punching bag nationally for really no reason, undeservingly so, I should say. But to see Oregon go that direction, it's not surprising. And I think you're going to continue to see teams go that route of eliminating games that can't help you. And that's the reason that you don't need to play. That's why Indiana doesn't need to play the Virginias. Oregon doesn't need to play the Washington States, because the win, although it's better than a win against, an FCS opponent, it doesn't do anything for you, and it can only harm you if you lose to them. Like, it'd be one thing if Washington State was competing for a national championship. If Virginia was expected to be competing for a national championship, that's a game that can help your resume. But whenever they're Like, for example, Virginia, I saw, was listed as the 98th best team in college football this year. If you're playing them, that does nothing for you, and it can only hurt you if you lose to them. So until people wrap their mind around that, which many probably won't, they just want to complain and find ways to be angry about stuff, then, they'll never figure it out. But it's just the way things are now with college football. So want to throw that in there. Also, on the NFL side of things, I know we got preseason games underway, which, aren't my favorite time of year, but it is football and it is what it is. But one thing on the Colts side of things, Anthony Richardson did dislocate his widow pinky finger during one of their preseason matchups against the Ravens this past weekend. Definitely affecting him in some way, shape, or form, especially with this quarterback battle against Daniel Jones. I mean, when it comes to this quarterback battle, right, it's a battle of mediocrity. It's a battle of young mediocrity with Anthony Richardson, of course, unproven talent, if you will, and then Daniel Jones, who I'm sure many would say is washed up in many ways. And I really don't know what the best direction for the Colts is going to be when it comes to their quarterback situation. I think many people would really just rather them see kind of start over, if you will. I don't know if I'm completely right about that. I'm sure many people like to see things work out with one of the two, but I think when it comes to realistic expectations, I don't think anybody expects the Colts to do anything of importance with either of these two quarterbacks. Maybe I'm wrong, but Colts fans have been kind of in limbo since they lost Andrew Luck, a few years ago, when he decided to step away from the game after having a couple of injuries. I mean, the Indianapolis Colts were spoiled for a long time with Peyton Manning and then Andrew Luck in back-to-back eras, if you will, when it comes to their quarterback room. And now they're struggling to find anybody that can give them any sort of consistency. I mean, Joe Flacco last year was a joke. My wife and I went up to the Bills-Colts game whenever that game was played during, I guess it was in November. And Joe Flacco, similar to Daniel Jones. I guess it might be two totally different levels right now, but Joe Flacco looked like he was on a different planet when it comes to where he used to be. It's definitely not Baltimore Ravens Super Bowl era Joe Flacco, that's for sure. But as it happens in the NFL, your prime time to be as good as you can be for most players is not for long. That's why they say the NFL stands for not for long, jokingly, of course. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with this quarterback battle. I mean, Richardson's kind of shown that he doesn't really have he hasn't always had the mental capacity to deal with setbacks. And so I'll be interested to see how things play out with him, or if Daniel Jones ends up taking snaps. I mean, what a waste of a draft pick, though, by the way. If you end up going with Daniel Jones over your former rookie. I know he's not a rookie anymore, but it still seems like he is, because you've not really seen a lot out of Anthony Richardson since he's been with the Colts. But what a waste of a pick back whenever he was drafted. And he wasn't even good at Florida. That's the other thing. Anthony Richardson was based solely off of his build and his cannon of an arm. He was never really a good like quarterback, if you will. He doesn't have the accuracy. He doesn't necessarily have the mobility, and he also doesn't always show that he has the toughness. So we'll see how things work out for him in the long term. I don't really think things will go well for him, but maybe I'll be wrong. All right, two more. This is really kind of two things in one. Two little kind of silly things, I guess. And I'm really just asking the listeners this because I haven't watched either of these things yet. But they're both sports-related TV shows / movies. And one of them actually has to do with Indiana, from what I've seen in the trailer. And that is the TV show Stick that's on Apple TV. The golf show, and I believe, I guess it takes place in Indiana. I know one of the characters has an IU hat on. So I'm curious. Let me know down below if you're somebody who has seen any of that show with Owen Wilson. It looks funny. And I think a lot of the people who worked on Ted Lasso also worked on this show. So if you think that show's worth watching and you've seen any of it, let me know. And then also Happy Gilmore 2. I've got a confession to make. I've never seen Happy Gilmore 1, which I know many people say is one of the funniest, not just sports movies, but funniest Adam Sandler movies, classics of all time. And a lot of people have mixed thoughts on this Happy Gilmore 2. And of course, me being kind of the gatekeeper that I am when it comes to entertainment, I won't watch Happy Gilmore 2 until I watch Happy Gilmore 1. So I guess another question, if you feel obliged to answer, is Happy Gilmore as good as people say that it is? Is it overrated? And then also, does the sequel live up to the Happy Gilmore name, or is it a joke of a sequel and it wasn't necessary? I've heard the amount of celebrity appearances in Happy Gilmore 2 is absolutely insane. I think I've heard that there's 70 plus different people, famous people that just show up in that show. And I guess most of them are probably golfers, but still, let me know down below if Happy Gilmore 2 is worth my time. As somebody who's never seen the first one, and of course now the second one being a big deal nowadays. So one last thing before we wrap up today's show too, also YouTube comments. Just want to mention there have been several who have responded to mine and Mitchell's, I guess, request, if you will, on whether or not you'd be interested in seeing a live stream reaction to away Indiana football games this year. And some of you are on board with that, and that's exciting. So we're definitely going to look into it in some way, shape, or form. We may not do it every time. We may just do a trial run during one of the away games just to see how it goes. But we'll definitely take a closer look and see how that may work out for us. Because, I mean, to do a live stream that long, that's a long time. Football games are 3+ hours. And, I mean, in most cases, that's the case. Maybe we'll have to, again, kind of figure out the logistics of it and see how we'll be able to make it work. But we're glad that some of you all are interested in that. So it may be something we decide to give a shot here during the upcoming season. So that's going to wrap it up for this week. We'll be back, of course, next week to talk more about the upcoming football season. Week 0 will finally be less than a week away at that point. And then from there on, we've got football until February, right? Of course, because we'll have college football rolling, and then the NFL will get started. Not started. The NFL get started. My God. Things will get started shortly after that with the NFL, and then we got basketball that will get sandwiched in between all of it. So we're finally getting rolling here very shortly here with a new sports calendar, and I'm glad to get things started here with you guys once again this year for another year of In Touch with Indiana Sports. So until next week, I should say, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by thehoosier.com.